The great puzzle. I've mentioned this before in sermons. I've talked about it a lot during Sunday school. The great puzzle is this world, where this world can be a place of pleasure and glory and goodness. We can have things in this world that are so rich and glorious and deep. Then there can be things in this world that are so tragic. Reggie mentioned these shootings, wars, human beings themselves. They can be the most amazing creatures imaginable and the most terrible demons. How can this be? All in one world, all in one creature. In many ways, the story of the Bible walks us through these questions. Israel is delivered from Egypt and given a promised land to Zion. She always struggled with disobedience and rebellion. Seldom realized the vision of a land flowing with milk and honey. You can read those great chapters at the end of Deuteronomy of covenant blessings and covenant curses. She lived most of the time in the biblical story in exile, even in her own land. And always this nagging question, will God deliver Israel? And will God redeem the world beyond Israel? Because Israel was always missional. Right there in Exodus 19, when Moses went up to God and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, this is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to Israel. Israel never seemed to be able to fully realize this calling. Over the last few weeks, we've talked about how the church moved out into the sea. You had God-fearing Gentiles enfolded. You had Cornelius in Caesarea. And then you had churches popping up in the Roman Empire, like in Antioch in Syria, where there were just Gentiles. And here you have this group of people that believes in Jesus. How does this happen? Jesus, the King of the Jews, is colonizing Rome in Rome. A church springs up in Rome. Wasn't planted by Paul, wasn't planted by Peter. We're not exactly sure who planted it, but this word about Jesus and his resurrection and how that sort of applied to life started in the Jewish network of synagogues and then overflowed it out into the Gentile world in the Roman Empire. And these churches were very difficult things for Romans to get their minds around because they were a hodgepodge of all these different categories of people. There were poor and wealthy people in these churches. Rome was a very status-oriented society. Poor and wealthy people didn't gather together around a table. Generally speaking, the slaves would put food on the table, and the rich would eat food off the table. In these Christian churches, rich and poor called themselves brother and sister. Slave and free, another dramatic difference. About half of the Roman Empire were slaves. Half. And this was a dramatic difference between people. And here in these Christian churches, slave and free called each other brother and sister. That didn't happen in Roman society. And then there were Jews and Gentiles. One of the dramatic things about the Jews was they were separate from the other people in the empire. And that separation caused a lot of friction. And now suddenly, in these new churches, you had Jews and Gentiles together. We talked about that with respect to Peter and clean and unclean. So events were outstripping people's understanding of what was actually going on. If you read Daniel 7, you have these dramatic stories of these sea monsters coming up out of the great sea. And this is very symbolic about these empires that were coming up in the world and devouring all the little kingdoms. Assyria did it to the northern kingdom. Babylon did it to the southern kingdom. The Persians came through. The Greeks came through. And by the time the Romans came through, the world had never seen, at least around the Mediterranean, something like the Roman Empire. So these monsters from Daniel 7 come up out of the Great Sea and they devoured the nations. But the Old Testament had language like that. If you read Job chapter 41, you read about Leviathan. And the relationship between the Lord and Leviathan was always a little interesting because on one hand, when Job is saying, I want God to explain himself, God says, consider Leviathan, the great sea monsters. Can you understand them? Can you put a hook in its mouth? The implication is, even these are not beyond the work of the Lord. So then the question that Israel asked in her prayers, why doesn't the God of Israel just kill the monsters from Daniel 7 so they don't terrorize the earth? These monsters are, of course, Rome and Persia and Alexander the Great and all of these great ancient empires. Why doesn't the Lord just shut them down? Well, Romans 1 has a number of verses about the wrath of God against the Gentile world. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature has been clearly seen, being understood from what has been seen, so people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds and animals and reptiles. Look at the Egyptian gods. Therefore God gave them over to the desires of their hearts, to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with one another and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Therefore, just as they did not think it worthy to retain knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what they ought not to be done. They become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent and arrogant and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decrees that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these things, but also approve of those who practice them. That's a huge list. This is targeted to the Gentiles. Chapter 2 will be targeted to the Jews. Chapter 3 will be targeted to all. Does this mean that humanity's disobedience has brought about the wrath of God that we suffer from? Is the sea of chaos sort of part of the wrath of God? Are these monsters themselves that come out of the sea part of the wrath of God? Now, it would be helpful to give a very long, nuanced answer And if you want long and nuanced, you can look at the adult Sunday school program because that is very long and nuanced. But the short answer is yes. And it's easily summarized by the great existential quote, hell is other people. And this brings us back to the great puzzle. How can human beings on one hand be so amazing and glorious, and on the other hand, the kinds of creatures that will take a gun and shoot up a school or a mall or destroy a country? How can the world be fixed? Well, people polluted the plot. How can people be fixed? Well, now we're talking about probably what all of us struggle with. Because if you sit down and think about even those you love probably more than anybody else in the world, there's probably a laundry list of ideas that you have about how would I improve them? Just think about it. I wish they were this way and not that way. I wish they were this way and not that way. And maybe you've been married to that person, or maybe you brought that person into the world, or maybe they brought you into the world. And for all of your efforts, guess what? You've made hardly any progress in transforming them to the way that you think they should be. Isn't that funny? Now, there's some huge ways that people imagine this can be had. One of which is, well, there are good people and bad people, so separate them, maybe kill them, exile them, imprison them. Okay. Read about Noah's flood. Take the single best man in the world, preserve his family, kill everyone else. How did that turn out? Well, within a few generations, the world was like it was before. Solzhenitsyn notes, the line between good and evil isn't between me and you, it's inside of me. That doesn't work. Well, how about rules and laws? Take good laws and strictly enforce them. Now, on one hand, we all believe in that, we all live by that. We live in a nation full of laws that are enforced. Yet, we also know, well, if things aren't enforced, people don't comply. Then you've got the other dynamic that even good laws can be used by evil people to do harm. The good power of the law can be used to do evil in the world. So, does that work? Someone has an interesting ringtone. Basically, if you look at Romans 2, good laws, strictly enforced, don't work. Evidence? How about the entire Old Testament? Israel is given the law from Sinai. Does it accomplish anything? Well, they say they'll do everything God commands. The book of Deuteronomy. Lists of covenant blessings, covenant curses. What happens to Israel? Well, Israel is a microcosm of humanity. She seems unable or unwilling to keep the covenant, and so suffers the covenant curses, which are the wrath of God. So where do we go now? Paul wrestles with these things and talks about them in what is really the thesis statement for the book of Romans. I am obliged both to Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and the foolish. That is why I'm so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are in Rome. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. Now, a few times in the sermons, I've talked about what I call nature religion and escape religion. Those are sort of two buckets that, if you're sorting through the world's religions, some of them you look at and say, well, that's nature religion. Some of them you look at and say, that's escape religion. And even things that aren't religions, you can sort of put in these two buckets. What is nature religion? Nature religion is basically do good things happen. Go to the gym every day, eat right, take care of your body, and you will have greater health. Seems to work. Practice good fiscal policy, don't overspend, you'll have good fiscal health. Have good laws in a country, have good leaders, manage things well, things will go better. All of these things are good. The trouble with it is, we're not always that good at being good. And I think all of us understand that. Christianity isn't simply a nature religion. Because, and we notice this regularly, someone takes good care of themselves, seems to do the right thing, and dies a young death. Someone does the right thing and is punished for doing the right thing. You see this all over the place. Yet, Christianity understands sowing and reaping. Generally speaking, if you do good things should come. Then there's escape religion. Escape religion tries to address the flaws of nature religion by noticing and thinking about, well, what happens in the next life. Now, in our particular period, there's a lot of people who are skeptical about a next life, but even in American surveys, those are 15, maybe 20% of the population. 80% of Americans believe, well, there's probably something coming after death. Escape religion basically says we are rescued away from this world, from the wrath of God, or the gods, or chaos, or evil, or however the religion imagines it. The trouble with escape religion is always, well, real life matters. People matter. Stuff in this world matters. Christianity isn't really an escape religion either. Although it helps, although help does come from heaven into the world, and faithful Christians are promised relief from the trials of this world beyond this world, a lot of Christianity addresses us here and now. And this fundamental difference holds tight throughout the book of Romans. Now, with nature religion, better performance in this world means better outcomes in this world. And again, we saw that's often true. But it's too simple. The book of Job gets at that, because in the book of Job, Job is the best man in the world. He's good to his children. He loves God. He sacrifices for his children. He's good to his neighbor. He is good to the poor in the city. If anybody has a need, Job is there to meet it. He's there in the city gates if there needs to be justice done in the city. Job is portrayed as the best man you can find in the world. And then, of course, there's this wager. Satan says to God, well, people are only good because of nature religion. They know that the aim is fixed, and so they're only doing good because they want good outcomes. That's not real goodness. Real goodness looks more like generosity. So the Lord says, have you considered my servant Job? And Satan says, yeah, but he proves the point. And the Lord says, take away all his good fortune, and let's see what happens. There's the question of the book of Job. In many ways, the story of Jesus is a reprise on this, because you have the Son of God who is sinless, and he certainly doesn't get his best life now. How many of you, if you had a child, would say, okay, we want you to be a very good boy, we want you to do all the right things, but by the age of 30, you're going to walk around, you're going to make everybody angry with you, and they're going to strip you naked and execute you in the most humiliating, painful way we've been able to develop in our culture. Well, that doesn't sound like a very nice life. And so Jesus and Job sort of rub against nature religion and says, you can't really answer the world's problems with nature religion. There's more to account for than simply karmic math. Well, what about escape religion? Well, that's sort of the same problem. Everybody's doing the right thing because they have a very vivid understanding of punishment in the afterlife or reward in the afterlife. Well, people wrestle with that. And once you say that's all there is, then they want to know where the line is. Because they want to sort of, well, how good do I have to really be in this world? Do I have to be like Mother Teresa good? Or if I just pay my taxes and keep the lawn nice, is that enough to make the cut? And then people start, in either case, to try to game the system. And people come in and say, well, that's not really goodness. Goodness looks more like generosity. So you have to beware of pushing escape religion too far. If you see the limitations of karmic math in this world, it should inform you of your limitations to do this math in the afterlife. And then so suddenly everybody wonders, well, Judgment Day comes. Have I done enough to make the cut? It's sort of like Oscar Schindler at the end of the movie on Schindler's List. What if I sold the Benz? What if I sold my watch? What if I sold my ring? Paul addresses this in this book of Romans. Now, unlike the great stories of the Old Testament in Genesis and Exodus and Samuel and Kings, and then the Gospels in the New Testament, the book of Romans is an extended argument in a letter sent to the church at Rome. And Paul notes right off the bat, he feels obliged, he feels indebted, both to Gentiles, because those are his people, and to Jews, because they're his people too. And he wants to try to figure out how Jesus answers both groups of people. This good news that Paul is declaring is world-changing in its scope. It addresses both the betterment of this world and hope in it for the next world. It is for Jews and Gentiles. It is God's saving work, not just for the focus of his saving work in Israel, but for his saving work for the whole world. He sees it as fulfillment of Israel's missional call. And it is not just for the sophisticated, people who know philosophy and think about politics and have power and education. It's in fact something that the simplest person can grasp. In fact, we notice sometimes the simple grasp it in a more real way than the sophisticated who can talk about it. It's a mysterious thing in that way. That is why I'm eager to preach the gospel, also to you who are in Rome. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew and then to the Gentile. Now you might think, why would he say he's ashamed of it? Well, now this gospel, this word, this news, this idea has been flooding out into the Roman Empire, and reviews are coming in. And as we saw in Pisidian Antioch, sometimes when Jewish groups hear it, they've got questions. They've got questions about, well, this guy that's your hero, we've heard about him. Wasn't he crucified by the Romans? We like our leaders uncrucified. We like our heroes victorious. Surely anyone who dies on a Roman cross is unworthy either as a moral exemplar or especially as someone who can take on the sea monsters of the world. And so Jews were looking at this Jesus story and saying, I don't think so. You shouldn't really talk about this guy. Gentiles also had questions because they said, okay, let me get this straight. So a God becomes a man. Yeah, you can find this in Homer. But then he's crucified, which releases his spirit, and his spirit ascends into heaven and then rules over the world. Yeah, that makes sense. But you say he rose from the grave, and that he ate fish, and that you could touch him again. That goes in the wrong direction, because truly good things don't decay. Truly good things aren't physical. And so both to the Jews and to the Greeks, this message from Paul is, well, this is strange. You shouldn't talk this way. And he says, I'm not ashamed of this because it is the power of God. What does that mean? The power of God that brings salvation. Okay, well, what do you mean by salvation? Well, it brings salvation into this world, nature religion. Now, this is where week after week I put Tom Holland's cover, because Tom Holland had this story where the longer he read the Greeks and the Romans, the more he realized that even though at first they seemed glorious and really cool, they were moral monsters. And that all of his moral imagination was really filled with Jesus. And the fact that we don't take mass shooters and mass killers as exemplars of divine favor, which the Greeks and the Romans very well might have done, is because of Jesus. That this power of God through Jesus has already transformed the world's moral imagination to such a way that to think as a Roman or a Greek now, morally, is unthinkable to us. So it's the power of God in this world to reshape our nature religion, and it's the power of God to reshape our moral imagination of what happens next after this world. And it's available not to only Greeks and not Jews, or not to only Jews and not Greeks, to everyone who trusts, believes. And Paul's going to say a lot more about that as the book continues. So this is good news for Jews and good news for Gentiles. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. A righteousness that is by faith, from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. Now here you have this word righteousness, which is a word that I've talked about before. The righteous cop turns down the bride. The righteous cop goes into danger even though the righteous cop knows he might lose his life and it will cost him something. That's the definition of righteousness. The corrupt cop accepts the bribe because who doesn't want more money? The corrupt cop runs away from the dangerous situation because, someone's shooting. What is this righteousness that makes the cop a useful person, a person who brings justice and flourishing to a community? And where does this righteousness come from? Now, righteousness of God is an ambivalent phrase because it can mean a righteousness that God in himself possesses, and it can mean a righteousness that God can give to someone to possess them, like the righteous cop. The righteousness of God can be a kind of righteousness that God has, a righteousness whose source is God, and it means the transference of God's righteousness to us. Now, and then he says, how do the righteous live? The righteous live by faith. The righteous cop moves towards danger. Why? Well, they have righteousness. It's the right thing to do. The righteous cop may lose their life, but it goes on a promise that their sacrifice won't be in vain. The righteous cop can act righteously because of faith in God, in this world, nature religion, and in the next. As we get through the book of Romans, and we're only going to spend a few weeks on it at 11 o'clock, we've spent a lot more on it in the Sunday school lesson, it attempts to address the great puzzle. Because at the heart of the great puzzle is this: how can the Creator God be good? Is God righteous? The Creator God, the Bible says, is the Redeemer God. The work of this God addresses both this world, nature, and our journey into the next, escape. Faith and trust is the key. Now, misery remains part of our lives, as it remained with Jesus. He was a man of sorrows. Suffering and evil and wrath remain a part of this world. Job suffers, not because he did anything wrong, contra his friends. Jesus is rejected and killed. That's a function of this world that Job and Jesus suffer from, as do we all. We have faith and trust issues. The good we would do, we don't do. The evil we don't want to do, we do. The line between good people and bad people runs through all of our hearts. Good laws strictly enforced, well, they can help, but they never complete the task. Our rebellion can turn even good laws against our neighbors and ourselves. One has come, however, to address the wrath of God. Now, this was the great surprise. The great surprise was the cross. Everyone imagined Jesus would separate good people from bad people, lift up the good people, punish the bad people. And he did a little bit of that. It wasn't at the heart of his mission. People imagined Jesus would set down good laws strictly enforced. Well, Jesus did talk about how to live, but not exactly in the way that people imagined. So, because he came the first time to endure wrath, that was the strange thing. And to demonstrate that wrath can be resolved. The righteousness that God has is revealed in the crucifixion of Jesus. And then Jesus turns around and says, "You will be my witnesses." Well, what does that mean? Well, you will be little Christs all over the world. The church as a collective will be like Christ, and the individual Christians will be like Christ. Always only a little part, but a part of a larger whole. Christians will live out righteousness in the world. That's their job. A righteousness whose source is from God is revealed through faith and trust in the context of the world. That faith, trust, and beauty is contagious and longed for. Now, all of this in the book of Romans is given in a long argument, which is rational and theoretical. And so when we treat the book of Romans, there's a lot of theory and there's a lot of argument. But Paul is fleshing this out because in Jesus, it wasn't so much given by Jesus as a long argument. It was enacted by Jesus. Because in many ways, it came down to this one thing. Jesus, who his disciples believe is the Messiah, the Anointed One, the Son of God, after he had been betrayed, called in the angels, rounded up Judas, and said, "We have laws against betrayal here. Judas, you've broken the law." Jesus didn't do any of that. On the night he was betrayed, he took bread and he broke it. And he said, "This is my body. I am going to suffer the wrath of God that you deserve on your behalf. I will pay a price you cannot afford. I will do a job you cannot endure. I will do something for you that you cannot do yourself." After having said that, he said, Do this in remembrance of me. What? If we can't do the job, why are we to follow you in it? Well, he knows we won't do the job exactly like he did, but he takes the job that we do and uses it for his larger purpose. That's this story of righteousness enacted.